afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Kettles, the Executive Director with Cure Glaucoma Foundation, and today we're joined by Dr. Joel Palko. Did I pronounce that correctly?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Palko is an assistant professor of ophthalmology at West Virginia University Eye Institute in Morgantown, West Virginia. I wanted to speak with Dr. Palko to find out how a grant from the American Glaucoma Society's MAPS Award program helped his early research efforts. MAPS stands for Mentoring for the Advancement of Physician Scientists. Cure Glaucoma Foundation has been making donations to this important program for the last 7 years because our founders, who are also glaucoma clinicians and research scientists, understood the importance of supporting young researchers early in their career. Dr. Palko wrote that he used this funding to develop an ultrasound procedure that measures vascular flow around the optic nerve head. So welcome, Dr. Palko. Thank you for taking time to speak to us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Certainly.
And thanks for the support. Yes.
Oh, absolutely. We really do understand how important it is, and we're eager to hear how it's impacted your research as well. Can you tell a little bit about your background, what led you to your interest in medicine and also in research?
Sure. So when I was in undergrad, I was an engineering student, and I did some internships in traditional engineering fields and chemical engineering, and realized that sitting at the desk and working on those problems didn't fit me very well. So that's when medicine kind of piqued my interest, because I started working on some biomedical engineering projects with some physicians in Pittsburgh. And that's really what sparked my initial interest in medicine. And then I did my medical school training at Ohio State University, where I started working with Dr. June Liu. She is a specialist in ocular biomechanics, and she was my initial mentor and actually introduced me to the eye and to glaucoma. And from there I got to know many of the ophthalmologists and the physicians at Ohio State, and that's pretty much where I fell in love with ophthalmology in general.
And were you from Pittsburgh?
Yes, I originally grew up about an hour east of Pittsburgh in a place called Latrobe.
I see. Okay. And so did you start your research between your undergraduate and medical school or after medical school?
So I started my research in biomechanics while I was an undergrad, but it wasn't with the eye in particular. It was with looking at ligaments around the knee
I see.
At the University of Pittsburgh. And then when I got to medical school, I applied some of those techniques essentially to the eye with Dr. Liu. And then I took a year off between my second and third year of medical school just to focus on research of the eye. And we did some great glaucoma research working on a canine model of glaucoma while I was at Ohio State.
Okay. And then once you got out of medical school, you applied, I understand, in 2019 for the MAPS grant?
That's correct. Well, I applied for the MAPS grant after fellowship, actually.
Okay.
So we did. I did my residency training at WashU in St. Louis, at Washington University in St. Louis, and then I did my specialized in glaucoma surgery. I did a year of training in that at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. And then right after that is whenever I started at West Virginia University as an assistant professor, as a clinician scientist. And that's right when I started at West Virginia is when I applied for the MAPS Award through the American Glaucoma Society.
So do you just borrow lab space when you're kind of getting started in research and then you get the award and you're able to kind of fund the program that way?
Yes, that's a great question. Every institution is different with that. Thankfully, at West Virginia, we have a pretty well-developed ophthalmology research center with several well-funded principal investigators. So it's always nice to start your research career surrounded with that environment and to have those sorts of resources and the space that people let you share. Most of the time in research, people are very collaborative and open. So I've had some great mentors since I've started here at West Virginia, and they've let me borrow some of their resources to get up and going. And obviously the MAPS helps. The MAPS award helps myself, buy some of the instrumentation that you need to get going as well.
Could you tell us a little bit about the result that you were able to get from it? You were using ultrasound, I understand, to measure, is it the velocity of the fluid around the optic nerve head?
Yes, absolutely. So we still don't, for all the great research that has been done with glaucoma, we still don't completely understand what causes glaucoma. There's a lot of different theories out there involving the mechanical environment of the optic nerve, since we know it's a pressure issue. There's some that believe that, or at least in some patients, that it's a vascular issue and the nerve doesn't get enough blood flow and oxygenation to it. And then there's ideas that there's some inflammatory reactions, chronic inflammation, things like that all contribute to glaucoma advancing or developing glaucoma. Right now, we have some great imaging techniques that we can use in the clinic using optical coherence tomography, so OCT, which is an optical technique that we use to measure, most of the time, measure the thickness of the nerve fiber layer around the optic nerve head to track glaucoma progression. But there's also a technique that uses that same principle to measure essentially the vasculature around the nerve in the clinic. But the one limitation of that technique, because it's optical, is it doesn't penetrate very far through the tissue. So to get to the blood vessels that we think are actually involved with the progression of glaucoma around what's called the lamina cribosa of the nerve, you need a technique that's able to penetrate deeper into the tissue. And that's when we started looking into this ultrasound technique. A lot of my previous experience with ultrasound was using high frequency, high resolution ultrasound to measure the mechanical properties around the optic nerve head. So I kind of leveraged that experience to start using it to measure blood flow around the optic nerve head. So what we do is and these is all ex vivo eyes, so eyes that are taken out of animals already. We essentially cannulate the vasculature to the eye, and we're able to control the blood pressure to the eye, or the perfusion pressure. And we inject tiny little microbubbles that are a few microns in size, and we're able to track those microbubbles as they flow around the optic nerve head and get pretty accurate measurements of their velocity as we control things like pressure in the eye. So it's giving us some of our first images of blood flow of these vessels that go through the sclera and go to the optic nerve head that we weren't able to see before using our traditional clinical techniques.
I see. That's interesting. I remember talking to another researcher. He was talking about the difference between the pressure and the fluid, like in the spinal column, and the eye, and how that differential may be of interest, because that's really describes the influence of the pressure on that.
Yes. So that's actually another variable that we're starting to control as well, because we take out the entire all of the orbital tissue. We can actually cannulate the optic nerve sheath as well and control the pressure right behind the nerve. So there's a theory that the connection between the brain and the eye, that is one continuous system where the pressure there is counteracted by the intraocular pressure right around the nerve. So that what we call the translaminar pressure gradient. So right at the optic nerve head, you have the pressure coming from the eye, so pushing back on the optic nerve head, and then you have the pressure right behind the optic nerve head that is essentially the same sort of fluid that surrounds the brain, and that pressure. And there's a theory that in some patients, especially patients that have lower intraocular pressure, that they might have a different type of intracranial pressure as well that might lead to glaucoma.
I see. Okay. And you also mentioned that after you've been able to collect this kind of preliminary data, that you plan to apply for a K-series grant
Yes, yes. So certainly when you're early in your career, you want to get additional training in research that can be a little more formal. And the NIH has great grants that allow us to do that, especially as clinician scientists that are interested in basic science research. So there's grants called KO8 grants that can provide you with the time and some of the resources to eventually get the data that you need to apply for larger grants like R01s that can keep a lab going for several years. So we're in the process of doing that right now. We've also applied for a different type of NIH grant called a COBRA grant that we recently we submitted about 6 months ago or so that we're hoping to get funded, which is more of an institutional grant that I'm a part of at the West Virginia University Eye Institute. So it funds about 3 or 4 investigators for a few years as well. And usually it's for states that typically don't get a lot of NIH funding, and West Virginia happens to be one of those states. So we are eligible to apply for that. So that's another grant that we're also submitting for. So the MAPS award is great because it allowed me to essentially buy some of the basic equipment that I needed to do to start these experiments. So some of the syringe pumps that control the volume that we put into the eye in very small amounts at very slow flow rates on the microliter level was one of the instruments that we bought with the MAPS, and also a pressure transducer that allows us to measure the pressure that we're putting into the front of the eye and into the vasculature of the eye. So those were key instruments for my research, that essentially collecting data with that allows you to apply for these training grants and the COBRA grants.
Well, that's fantastic to hear that you were well supported early on, and really how important it is to have that to use as a springboard to further research and get bigger grants. I'm also curious how you, as a clinician who treats glaucoma patients on a routine basis, how your time in the laboratory kind of affects your patient care, and how it might expand your understanding of glaucoma or your treatment.
It's great actually. It really keeps you excited, and it goes in both directions. So as you do research and think of new ideas or come to new conclusions, there's always things that you can start applying to your patients. It's a little more difficult on the basic science level because there's a lot more steps before it becomes translational, and you can it can actually help a patient. It takes a lot more time to start there. But it always keeps you thinking. Like, I'm always thinking about blood flow to the eye in my patients. So I get the clinical imaging that's available to us, like the OCT angiography that we discussed before. And then I'm always asking about blood pressure. And some patients, I have them monitor their blood pressure just to get an idea of how that and their pressure are interacting with one another throughout the day that might be contributing to their glaucoma, especially when I think that they're someone that we're controlling the pressure pretty well, but they're still progressing. You always look for other things that might be contributing to the disease. And then I think it's especially important going from the clinical side to the research side as you see more patients, especially when you're starting out, and you get all these new ideas that kind of spark research interests, and it's great to be in an environment where you can think of those ideas or those clinical things that you've noticed that you may not have noticed before, or think that might be contributing to the disease, and then be able to take that to the research side and investigate a little bit more and add a little more value to the data that you're seeing.
Right. Well, that is really, I really appreciate your spending time with us today and sharing your insight and everything. And I hope our viewers feel better informed about the value of these American Glaucoma Society MAPS grants and realize their potential as a research springboard.
Yeah, it's a wonderful program, and it's my pleasure to discuss it with you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Palko. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.